The Boeing 737 had been circling the Atlantic for 47 minutes when Captain Marcus Reaper Kellerman realized they were all going to die. The commercial airliner, carrying 127 passengers and crew from Joint Base Andrews to Ramstein Air Base in Germany, had lost both engines to what intelligence would later classify as a coordinated electromagnetic pulse attack. But that revelation would come later. Right now, at 31,000 feet above churning black water, time had crystallized into a single, terrifying equation: gravity versus hope. The cockpit was a graveyard of dead screens and silent radios. Captain Jim Hawthorne, the airline pilot, had suffered what appeared to be a massive coronary when the engines died simultaneously. His co-pilot, a 28-year-old named Rodriguez, was hyperventilating into an oxygen mask, mumbling prayers in rapid-fire Spanish. The flight attendants had managed to keep most passengers calm, but seasoned military personnel don't stay calm long when physics starts winning. In the cabin's controlled chaos, families clutched each other. Children cried. A Marine colonel worked frantically on a satellite phone that refused to connect. Near the galley, 3 Air Force sergeants argued in hushed tones about glide ratios and emergency procedures they'd never actually executed. The mathematics were brutally simple. A 737 without engines becomes an expensive coffin with wings. Captain Kellerman moved through the cabin like a man possessed, his seal trident catching overhead lights as he searched faces. His team, 6 other operators returning from a classified mission in Somalia, watched their leader with the quiet intensity of predators assessing a hunt gone sideways. They'd survived Taliban ambushes, Somali pirates, and bureaucratic nightmares, but none of them knew how to fly a passenger jet with dead engines. "Listen up," Kellerman's voice cut through the rising panic. "I need pilots, military pilots, anyone who's actually flown something bigger than a crop duster." His eyes swept the cabin methodically, professionally. "We've got maybe 15 minutes of glide time left, and I need someone who understands flight surfaces, not just theory." Silence stretched like a held breath. A few passengers raised hesitant hands. A retired Air National Guard transport pilot with arthritis, a Navy helicopter pilot whose last fixed-wing experience was 20 years behind him. Hope flickered and died in Kellerman's eyes as he realized the inadequacy of his options. That's when she opened her eyes in row 6. Captain Samara Ghost Thorne had been sleeping so deeply that the initial crisis passed over her like background noise. Her body, conditioned by 3 deployments and countless night missions, had learned to filter out chaos unless directly threatened. But something in Kellerman's voice, the specific frequency of command desperation, penetrated her subconscious like an alarm clock designed by fate itself. She stretched slowly, deliberately, taking inventory of the situation with the methodical precision that had once made her the youngest female pilot to qualify for the Air Force's most classified programs. Captain Kellerman's eyes locked onto hers. His next words would change everything. "Ma'am, I don't suppose you know how to fly this thing." The question hung in recycled air, thick with fear and dwindling possibility, while outside the small windows, the Atlantic Ocean rose steadily toward them like a patient, hungry mouth. Samara Thorne unbuckled her seatbelt with movements so fluid they seemed choreographed. At 5'4" with prematurely silver hair pulled into a regulation bun, she looked more like a librarian than humanity's last hope. Her civilian clothes, dark jeans, a faded Georgetown University sweatshirt, offered no hint of her military background. No ribbons, no insignia, no visible proof of the classified world she'd inhabited for 15 years. "That depends," she said, her voice carrying a slight southern accent that somehow made everything sound reasonable, "on whether you're asking if I can land this aircraft safely, or if I can perform what the FAA would technically classify as a controlled water landing." Her fingers were already moving toward the aisle, muscle memory anticipating movement before her conscious mind had fully committed. Kellerman's jaw tightened. He'd heard that tone before, in briefing rooms where the impossible became merely difficult, where operators spoke about death like a logistics problem requiring creative solutions. "I'm asking if you can keep us breathing long enough to see tomorrow." "Then yes." Samara stood, and for the first time, Kellerman noticed the small scar along her left temple, the way her eyes automatically cataloged emergency exits, the subtle straightening of shoulders that signaled a shift from civilian to operator. "But I'm going to need your people to do exactly what I tell them when I tell them, without questions or suggestions." A businessman in row 4 laughed, high, nervous, disbelieving. "Are you seriously going to trust our lives to some random woman who—" "Shut up." Kellerman's command carried 15 years of authority. His eyes never left Samara's face. "Ma'am, what do you need?" She was already moving toward the cockpit, speaking over her shoulder with the clipped precision of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Get Rodriguez out of the pilot's seat and strapped in somewhere safe. I need your strongest operator in the co-pilot position, not to fly, but to handle manual controls when the hydraulics fail. And they will fail." "How do you know?" "Because I've done this before." Her words stopped conversations throughout the cabin. Even the children seemed to sense that something fundamental had shifted in their favor. Different aircraft, different ocean, but the same physics, the same mathematics of falling. Kellerman's team moved without hesitation, reading their captain's body language like a familiar tactical manual. They'd learned to trust his judgment about people. It had kept them alive through 3 combat deployments. If Reaper believed in this small woman with silver hair and steady hands, that was enough for operators who lived in the space between impossible and inevitable. The cockpit door opened like the entrance to a cathedral of dead technology. Rodriguez stumbled out, his face pale but relieved to escape responsibility he'd never trained for. Samara slid into the pilot's seat with the fluid grace of coming home, her hands finding controls in the darkness, with the certainty of muscle memory carved by thousands of flight hours. "What's your call sign?" Kellerman asked as he squeezed into the co-pilot's position, his large frame filling a space designed for smaller men. "Ghost." She was already studying the instrument panel, her fingers dancing across switches with the rhythm of a pianist warming up. "And before you ask, yes, I earned it the hard way." The altimeter read 23,000 feet and falling. Outside the cockpit windows, the Atlantic stretched endlessly in all directions, its surface broken by whitecaps that looked deceptively soft from their current altitude. Samara's hands found the flight controls, and immediately she understood why Rodriguez had been hyperventilating. Without engine power, the aircraft felt less like a machine than like a massive stone with wings, surrendering to gravity's patient inevitability. "Talk to me about our situation," she said, her voice steady as heartbeat. "What happened to the engines?" Kellerman's battlefield experience had taught him to organize chaos into digestible intelligence reports. Simultaneous failure at 347 Zulu. No warning, no mechanical indicators, just instant shutdown. Captain Hawthorne started chest compressions immediately after coronary, most likely stress-induced. "EMP?" Samara asked, her eyes scanning the dead instrument panel. "Working theory. Too coordinated to be mechanical failure, too complete to be anything else." He paused, watching her hands work with clinical precision. "Can you actually land this thing, Ghost?" She was quiet for a long moment, calculating angles and distances with the kind of mathematical intuition that separates competent pilots from legendary ones. The aircraft's glide ratio, their current altitude, wind conditions estimated from cloud formations visible through the windscreen, the weight distribution of passengers and fuel, variables cascaded through her mind like a complex equation resolving itself. "Define land," she finally said. "I define it as everyone walking away from this aircraft under their own power." "Then no." Her honesty cut through the cockpit like a blade. "But I can give us a chance. Maybe a good chance if everything goes exactly right and physics decides to be generous. Kellerman nodded grimly. He'd led men into operations with worse odds. What do you need? First, I need your people to move passengers forward, away from the tail section. In a water landing, that's where the aircraft breaks apart first. Second, I need everyone in brace positions 15 minutes before impact. Third, I need someone who understands radio protocols to start broadcasting our situation on emergency frequencies. Our radios are dead. The aircraft's radios are dead, but your SEALs returning from Somalia, somebody's carrying tactical communication equipment. It wasn't a question. She knew how special operations worked, knew the redundancies and backup systems that kept operators connected to civilization. Kellerman smiled for the first time since the engines died. You know what? I like you, Ghost. The altimeter read 20,000 feet. The mathematics of survival had begun in earnest, and somewhere far below, the Atlantic waited with the patience of geological time. In the cabin behind them, Kellerman's team moved with professional efficiency, repositioning passengers and securing loose objects that could become projectiles during impact. Samara could hear their voices, calm, authoritative, offering reassurance built on competence rather than false hope. These were men who understood that survival often depended on the quality of preparation in moments when preparation seemed impossible. Sergeant Morrison, Kellerman called over his shoulder, what's our communication status? A large black man with sergeant stripes tattooed on his forearm appeared in the cockpit doorway. Sir, I've got a tactical radio that survived the EMP, shielded military hardware, but transmission range is limited without aircraft systems for amplification. Range? Samara asked without looking away from the instrument panel. Maybe 50 nautical miles for voice, couple hundred for emergency beacon. That'll have to be enough. She was working through emergency procedures, her hands finding manual controls that most civilian pilots never touched. Start broadcasting our position and situation on Coast Guard emergency frequency 121.5. Tell them we're attempting water landing approximately 200 nautical miles southeast of Halifax. Give them our passenger count and the nature of our emergency. Morrison nodded and disappeared back into the cabin. Within moments, his voice began the steady, professional broadcast that might be their only connection to rescue. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is Air Transport Command Flight 447, Boeing 737, emergency water landing in progress. Samara allowed herself a moment to appreciate the irony. She'd spent 15 years flying aircraft so classified that their existence was officially denied, missions so sensitive that success was measured in secrets kept rather than medals awarded. And now, her most important flight would be broadcast across international emergency frequencies, recorded by multiple agencies, probably analyzed by aviation safety boards for decades to come. Ghost, Kellerman said quietly, can I ask you something? Depends on the question. How many times have you actually done this before? The altimeter read 18,000 feet. She could see individual waves now, white foam patterns that revealed wind direction and surface conditions. Once, she said. Different circumstances, different aircraft, but the same ending we're hopping for. Which was? Everyone walked away. She paused, her hands making minute adjustments to trim tabs and control surfaces. Eventually. The word eventually carried enough weight to sink its own aircraft, but Kellerman had learned not to ask follow-up questions when operators used that particular tone. Some stories were earned through survival rather than curiosity. Outside, the sky had begun its subtle transformation from the deep blue of high altitude to the lighter shades that meant Earth was rising to meet them. Time, which had seemed infinite in the first moments of crisis, now moved with the mechanical precision of a countdown timer. 16,000 feet, and falling toward a rendezvous with physics that would test everything Samara Thorne had ever learned about flying, falling, and the narrow space between death and legend. "Listen," Samara said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd learned to command respect through competence rather than rank. "When we get close to the water, things are going to happen very fast. The aircraft will want to nose down hard. That's where most water landings go wrong. I'll need to maintain the correct angle of attack manually, without engine power to help." She demonstrated the movement, pulling back on the yoke to show him the kind of pressure required. "If I become incapacitated, stroke, heart attack, whatever, your job is to keep pulling back on this control. Not too much, not too little. Think of it like you're trying to make the aircraft kiss the water instead of punching through it." Kellerman's hands wrapped around the co-pilot's yoke, feeling the resistance of manual flight controls. "How do I know if it's too much?" "If the aircraft stalls, we drop like a stone. If it's not enough, we hit the water at the wrong angle and break apart on impact." She glanced at him sideways. "But you won't need to worry about that because I'm not going to become incapacitated." "How can you be so sure?" "Because I've got unfinished business that requires walking away from this landing." The statement was delivered with such matter-of-fact certainty that Kellerman found himself believing her, despite the impossibility of their situation. The tactical radio crackled with Morrison's steady broadcast. "Emergency water landing, 127 souls on board, requesting immediate Coast Guard response, position approximately 43 degrees north, 58 degrees west." His voice carried the professional calm of someone who'd called in close air support under enemy fire, for whom precision under pressure was a survival skill honed through repetition. At 14,000 feet, Samara began her final approach briefing. "In about 8 minutes, I'm going to start our descent profile. When I tell everyone to brace, they need to do it immediately, heads down, hands over heads, feet flat on the floor. No exceptions, no hesitation." "What about the children?" "Parents need to hold them, but not too tight. In water landings, people sometimes hold their children so tightly they transfer their own panic. Children are actually better at surviving impacts. Their bones bend instead of breaking." Kellerman processed this information with the clinical detachment he'd learned in combat, filing away useful knowledge while suppressing the emotional implications. "Anything else?" "When we hit, if we're lucky, we'll float for maybe 90 seconds before the cabin floods. That's how long we have to evacuate everyone through emergency exits." She pointed to the aircraft's configuration on a laminated safety card. "Your people need to be positioned at each exit row, ready to deploy slides and assist passengers. No heroes, no delays, just efficient movement from aircraft to life rafts." The altimeter read 12,000 feet. Through the cockpit windows, individual waves were becoming visible, a constantly shifting surface that revealed the immense power waiting below them. Samara's hands moved across the control panel with increasing urgency, preparing the aircraft for what aviation textbooks called controlled flight into terrain. Except their terrain was 3 miles of Atlantic Ocean, and control was rapidly becoming a relative concept. 10,000 feet. The mathematics of survival were about to become physics. In the cabin, Kellerman's team had transformed 127 terrified passengers into something resembling an organized evacuation unit. Families had been separated and repositioned for optimal weight distribution. Emergency equipment had been located and prepared. The strongest passengers had been placed near emergency exits, while children and elderly had been moved to seats where they could be quickly assisted during evacuation. 2 minutes, Samara announced over the aircraft's PA system, her voice carrying throughout the cabin with crystalline clarity. "Everyone check your seatbelts one more time. When I give the brace command, assume the position immediately and hold it until we've come to a complete stop." She switched off the PA and looked at Kellerman. "Whatever happens in the next few minutes, I want you to know that your team's professionalism probably just saved 50 lives. Panic kills more people in emergency situations than the actual emergency. What about the other 77 lives? Those depend on how well I learned to fly in the dark. She was making final adjustments now, configuring the aircraft for an approach that existed in no flight manual, had never been practiced in any simulator, could only be executed through the kind of intuitive understanding that separated pilots from aviators. 8,000 feet. The ocean's surface revealed its true nature, not the smooth expanse it appeared from high altitude, but a dynamic landscape of moving hills and valleys, each wave representing a potential disaster or salvation depending on timing and angle. "Can I ask about your call sign now?" Kellerman said. "About how you earned it." Samara was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the approaching water. "Afghanistan, 2019. Night mission classified. My aircraft was shot down behind enemy lines and everyone assumed I was dead. Took me 11 days to walk out of Taliban territory." She adjusted the trim tabs one final time. "When I showed up at the forward operating base, my squadron commander said I looked like I'd seen a ghost. I told him I had my own." 6,000 feet. The point of no return had arrived with the inevitability of gravity itself. "Brace, brace, brace." Samara's voice filled the cabin through the PA system, and 127 people assumed crash positions with the discipline of soldiers following a final command. The Boeing 737 began its descent toward a rendezvous with the Atlantic Ocean, carrying within its aluminum hull the hopes, fears, and unfinished stories of everyone aboard. In the cockpit, Captain Samara Ghost Thorne prepared to attempt the most important landing of her life, while 31,000 feet below, the sea waited with infinite patience. Time compressed into a series of critical moments, each decision cascading into the next with the mathematical precision of physics in motion. 4,000 feet. Samara could see individual whitecaps now, could judge wind direction from the spray patterns. The ocean's surface revealed swells running northeast to southwest, not ideal for their approach angle, but workable if everything went exactly right. "Talk to me about our touchdown point," Kellerman said, his hands gripping the co-pilot's yoke with white-knuckle intensity. "See that area where the swells are more organized, less chaotic?" She pointed through the windscreen to a section of water that looked marginally calmer. "That's where we're going to kiss the ocean. The key is to land parallel to the wave direction, ride down the back of a swell instead of punching through the crest." 3,000 feet. The aircraft's descent rate had stabilized at what Samara hoped was a survivable angle. Too steep and they'd break apart on impact. Too shallow and they'd skip across the surface like a stone, tumbling into pieces with each contact. In the cabin, Morrison's voice continued its steady broadcast. "Coast Guard, Air Transport 447, we are beginning final approach. Estimate impact in approximately 90 seconds. Requesting immediate search and rescue response." Static crackled back, then a voice. "Air Transport 447, this is Coast Guard Rescue Halifax. We have multiple assets en route to your position, ETA 15 minutes. Remain on frequency." 15 minutes. Samara allowed herself a grim smile. If they were still transmitting in 15 minutes, it would mean her landing had worked. If not, well, the Coast Guard would be arriving just in time to begin recovery operations instead of rescue operations. 2,000 feet. Details became visible on the ocean's surface. Foam patterns, debris floating in the swells, the subtle color changes that revealed different water depths. Samara's hands made constant micro-adjustments to the controls, feeling the aircraft's responses through the yoke like a surgeon working by touch alone. "Flaps?" Kellerman asked, remembering fragments of military aviation knowledge. "No hydraulic pressure for flaps or landing gear. We're coming in clean and fast." She was working purely on manual controls now, fighting the aircraft's natural tendency to nose down without power. When we touch down, we're going to hit at about 140 knots instead of the normal 130. That 10 knots might not sound like much, but it's the difference between a controlled landing and controlled demolition. 1,000 feet. The psychological moment when theory became reality, when all the calculations and preparations converged into a single, irreversible event. Samara could see the texture of individual waves, could judge their height and spacing with the precision of someone who'd learned to read terrain from military necessity. 30 seconds, she announced over the PA. Hold your positions. The Boeing 737 descended through its final moments of flight, carrying 127 people toward a rendezvous with physics that would be measured in seconds but remembered for lifetimes. In the cockpit, two military veterans, one who'd learned to fight on water, one who'd learned to fly above it, prepared to test everything they'd ever learned about survival, teamwork, and the narrow margin between disaster and miracle. 500 feet. The ocean rushed toward them with the terrible inevitability of mathematics in motion. The final approach began with Samara's hands finding a rhythm on the controls that seemed almost musical, constant, subtle adjustments that kept the aircraft aligned with the wave pattern below. At 300 feet, she could see the power and chaos of the ocean's surface in terrifying detail. Each wave represented a potential disaster, but also a potential salvation if approached with the right angle and timing. 100 feet, Kellerman called out, his voice steady despite the circumstances. He'd learned to trust competent operators, and everything about Samara's movements suggested competence honed by experience he couldn't imagine. The aircraft's descent rate settled into what felt like a controlled fall. Without engine power, Samara was essentially gliding a 150,000-pound projectile toward a target that moved constantly, shifted unpredictably, and offered no margin for error. 50 feet, looking good, Ghost. She could see spray from the wave crests now, could judge the wind direction from the foam patterns. The ocean's surface revealed itself as a landscape of moving hills and valleys, each swell representing either an opportunity or a catastrophe depending on split-second timing. 30 feet, 20 feet. The moment of impact arrived with shocking suddenness. The Boeing 737's belly touched the Atlantic Ocean at exactly the right angle, at precisely the right moment in the wave cycle, with a sound like thunder mixed with breaking glass. The aircraft skipped once, twice, then settled into the water with the grinding roar of metal against liquid physics. For 5 seconds that felt like 5 hours, the aircraft rode the surface like a massive, unstable boat. Water sprayed over the windscreen in sheets. The fuselage groaned under stresses it was never designed to withstand. Then the flooding began. Everyone up, move to the exits. Samara's voice cut through the chaos as water began seeping through dozens of small fractures in the hull. 90 seconds, people, that's all we have. Kellerman's team moved with the precision of a special operations unit, opening emergency exits and deploying life rafts while water poured into the cabin through unsealed doors and fractured windows. The aircraft was settling by the tail, exactly as Samara had predicted, but the forward passenger compartment remained above water long enough for evacuation procedures to work. Ghost, time to go, Kellerman said, but Samara was still in the pilot's seat, hands on the controls, making final adjustments to keep the aircraft stable during evacuation. Not yet. The tail's going under first. I need to keep the nose up until everyone's out. Through the cockpit windows, she could see life rafts inflating around the sinking aircraft like orange lifeboats around a dying whale. Passengers were jumping into the water, swimming toward safety, their movements coordinated by Morrison and the other SEALs who'd remained in the ocean to assist. 60 seconds, someone shouted from the cabin. That's everyone, Morrison's voice carried across the water. Aircraft is clear. Only then did Samara release the controls and move toward the emergency exit. The Boeing 737 was settling rapidly now, its tail disappearing beneath the surface, with the mechanical finality of an equation resolving itself. She and Kellerman jumped simultaneously, hitting the Atlantic Ocean in a rush of cold shock and salt water. The life raft was orange, military grade, and crowded with 127 survivors who were still coming to terms with being alive. As Samara pulled herself aboard, water streaming from her civilian clothes, she looked back at the aircraft that had carried them safely to this impossible moment. The Boeing 737 disappeared beneath the waves with a sound like a sigh, leaving only debris and the orange rafts floating on swells that now seemed gentle rather than threatening. Coast Guard helicopter inbound, Morrison reported, his tactical radio somehow still functioning despite everything they'd survived. ETA 8 minutes. Samara sat in the life raft, surrounded by people she'd never met who were alive because of skills she'd learned in wars she couldn't discuss. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her most public heroic moment had emerged from her most classified background. "Ghost," Kellerman said quietly, settling beside her as the rescue helicopter's rotors became audible over the ocean's constant whisper. "I don't know what you did before today, but thank you." She looked at the faces around her, children who would grow up to tell stories about the woman pilot who saved their lives, parents who would remember this day as the moment everything changed, professionals who would carry new respect for competence regardless of its packaging. "Just doing my job," she said, but they both knew it had been much more than that. The Coast Guard helicopter appeared on the horizon like salvation with rotors, growing larger against the sky as it approached their position. Within hours, the story would begin spreading through military channels, then social media, then international news organizations. Captain Samara, Ghost, Thorne would become famous in ways that contradicted everything she'd learned about operational security and professional discretion. But for now, in this moment, floating on the Atlantic Ocean surrounded by people who were breathing because of her skills and judgment, she allowed herself a small smile. Some stories, she realized, were worth telling. Some heroic moments were worth being remembered. The rescue helicopter began its descent toward the life rafts, and 127 survivors prepared to return to a world where their impossible survival would become legend, where the woman in row 6 would be remembered not as a classified asset or a military secret, but as the pilot who turned falling into flying, disaster into deliverance, and physics into possibility. The helicopter's rescue basket descended toward the life rafts like mechanical salvation, operated by Coast Guard personnel who trained for exactly this scenario, but never expected to find 127 survivors from an aircraft that should have left no trace except debris. The rescue swimmer who entered the water moved with professional efficiency, but his eyes kept returning to Samara with something approaching wonder. "Ma'am, we're going to evacuate the injured and children first," he said, treading water beside their raft with practiced ease. "Can you give me a quick status report on casualties?" Samara looked around the life rafts, mentally cataloging what she saw. Surprisingly good condition overall. A few minor lacerations from broken glass, some shock cases, possible hypothermia developing in the elderly passengers, but no major trauma, no obvious internal injuries. The water landing worked better than anyone had a right to expect. The rescue swimmer nodded, already moving toward a life raft containing several children whose parents were showing signs of severe shock. But he paused, turning back to Samara with a question that had clearly been bothering him. "Ma'am, I've been doing this for 8 years, and I've never seen survivors from a total engine failure over open ocean. How the hell did you land that aircraft?" "Very carefully," she replied, and something in her tone suggested that was the only explanation he was going to receive. The evacuation proceeded with military precision, each passenger lifted from the rafts to the helicopter in order of medical priority. Samara insisted on being evacuated last, maintaining what she called pilot responsibility until every person under her command was safely aboard the rescue aircraft. As the basket descended for her final pickup, Kellerman grabbed her arm. "Ghost, when this story gets out, and it will get out, what do you want people to know?" She considered the question while watching the rescue basket sway in the helicopter's rotor wash. "I want them to know that training matters. That competence doesn't have a gender, doesn't have an age, doesn't have a particular appearance. And that sometimes the person who can save your life is sitting quietly in row 6, minding her own business until physics makes it her business." The rescue basket reached the water. Samara stepped into it with the same fluid grace she'd shown throughout the crisis, her movements suggesting someone accustomed to making dramatic entrances and exits. As she rose toward the helicopter, she looked down at the empty life rafts floating on the Atlantic swells, the last evidence of an impossible survival story that was already becoming legend in the radio chatter between rescue units. Inside the Coast Guard helicopter, medics worked efficiently to assess and treat survivors, but their eyes kept returning to the small woman with silver hair who'd somehow turned a death sentence into a rescue operation. Children pointed at her and whispered to their parents. Adults studied her with the kind of respect usually reserved for people who'd accomplished the impossible. "Captain Thorne," the helicopter's crew chief approached her with a satellite communication headset. "I've got CNN, BBC, and about 12 other news organizations requesting interviews. How do you want to handle media requests?" Samara accepted the headset but didn't put it on immediately. Through the helicopter's windows, she could see the coast of Nova Scotia approaching, solid land that represented safety and normalcy, and the end of the most important flight of her career. "Tell them I'll give one interview to one reporter when I'm ready. And tell them the story isn't about me. It's about 127 people who kept their heads in a crisis and trusted someone to do her job." The crew chief nodded, understanding instinctively that he was dealing with someone who'd learned to handle classified successes with professional discretion. "And if they ask about your military background?" "They can ask. Doesn't mean they'll get answers." She finally put on the headset, and immediately her ears filled with the controlled chaos of international media attention. Reporters shouting questions, producers demanding exclusive access, aviation experts requesting technical details about a landing that shouldn't have been survivable. She listened for a moment, then removed the headset and handed it back to the crew chief. "On second thought, tell them I'm not available for interviews. The Coast Guard can handle media relations. I'm just a passenger who happened to know how to fly." But even as she said it, Samara knew the story was already beyond her control. In the age of social media and instant communication, heroic moments became viral content within hours. Passengers were already posting cell phone videos taken during the evacuation, describing their rescue by a mysterious female pilot whose competence had seemed to emerge from nowhere. The helicopter touched down at Halifax International Airport, where ambulances waited to transport survivors to local hospitals for medical evaluation. As passengers disembarked, many stopped to speak with Samara, offering thanks that seemed inadequate for the magnitude of what she'd accomplished. A 7-year-old girl named Emma, traveling with her grandmother to visit relatives in Germany, approached Samara with the fearless directness that only children possess. "Are you really a pilot?" she asked. "I am. My daddy says girls can't fly big airplanes." Samara knelt down to the child's eye level, her expression serious. "Emma, your daddy is wrong about that. Girls can do anything they train hard enough to do, and sometimes, when it really matters, they can do things that nobody trained them for." The child nodded solemnly, processing this information with the gravity that children bring to life-changing moments. "I want to be a pilot like you." "Then study hard, work hard, and never let anyone tell you what you can't do." Samara stood, and Emma's grandmother approached with tears in her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you," the older woman said. "You saved my granddaughter's life." "She's going to save her own life many times over," Samara replied. "I just got her started." As the survivors were processed through medical evaluation and customs procedures, the story of Flight 447 began its transformation from emergency response to international news event. Aviation experts struggled to explain how a total engine failure had resulted in 0 fatalities. Military analysts noted the precision of the evacuation procedures. Media organizations competed for exclusive interviews with the woman who'd accomplished what textbooks said was impossible. But Captain Samara Ghost Thorne had already disappeared into the administrative machinery of international aviation incident investigation, her celebrity status complicated by a military background that couldn't be fully disclosed and a personality that preferred competence to recognition. The official investigation would take months. The media attention would last weeks. But the legend of the woman in row 6 who turned disaster into deliverance would last lifetimes, inspiring a generation of young women to pursue aviation careers and reminding the world that heroism often comes from unexpected sources, wearing civilian clothes, sitting quietly until called upon to save lives through nothing more complex than doing the job with extraordinary skill. 3 days after the landing, Samara stood in her small apartment in Arlington, Virginia, watching CNN replay cell phone footage of the water landing that had made her an accidental celebrity. The video showed the Boeing 737 touching down on the Atlantic with surprising grace, skipping twice before settling into what appeared to be a controlled water taxi operation. Her phone had been ringing constantly. Reporters, producers, book agents, movie studios, and aviation companies offering consulting contracts. She'd answered none of them. Military discipline had taught her that sometimes the most important response was silence, letting others fill the narrative space with their own interpretations and assumptions. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Through the peephole, she saw Captain Kellerman, now wearing civilian clothes that couldn't disguise his military bearing. Behind him stood Morrison and 2 other members of his SEAL team. "Ghost," Kellerman said when she opened the door, "we wanted to thank you properly, away from media attention and official incident reports." She invited them in, nodding automatically that they'd positioned themselves with sight lines to exits and windows, operational awareness that never fully switched off. These were men who'd survived multiple combat deployments by trusting each other's competence, and they'd extended that trust to her in circumstances where failure meant death for everyone. "How are you handling the celebrity status?" Morrison asked, settling into a chair that let him watch both the apartment entrance and the fire escape. "By ignoring it," Samara replied. "The story people want to tell isn't the story that actually happened. They want a fairy tale about unexpected heroism. I